And welcome to the BU annual faculty reading, which is a great event for us, and I think for the city as well. We're going to read tonight as the Kabbalah enjoins us in alphabetical order. And that means we're going to start with Dan Chazen, who is, I think, perhaps now the leading critic and certainly reviewer of poetry in America. A wonderful poet in his own right. If you were here last year, you heard part of a marvelous poem. Are you going to read from that again?
No.
Oh, you told me you were.
It's on the website.
Well, it's on the, well, too bad, but I'm sure this is equally wonderful. And Dan has been with us the last 2 years, and we hope for many, many years in the future. So Dan Chazen.
Thank you, Leslie. Is this okay? Is that all right? I figured enough people would have heard that poem already last year, and so I decided to try something else out. I'm not sure this is a very good idea at all, actually. It's an existential play in one act. It's really a poem. I would never want it to be performed, and you really couldn't perform it, but I needed the advantages of drama. I needed conflict and character and the feeling of 3 dimensions of a stage and so on. So I wrote it as a play. It's called The Ferris Wheel in Paris. It has 2 characters, both played by me. Dramatis personae, a man, a fairy. The Ferris Wheel in Paris. An empty stage, man stands at the front of the stage. Man. There would have to have been first something. First darkness, then a stage, then an actor and an audience. There must have been a single play, and then the idea of theater, and the human drive to be entertained or just to be happy. Curiosity about this category, human, must have been prior, must have been ancient. For a fairy to appear, there had to be fairies. For her to say my name, and I was there, standing at the stage's edge, saying my name. I had to exist already. My life had to be already making its way forward in the world. For me to have anything to say, to sketch my predicament, to introduce some key traits, for me to be granted a wish, for me to wish to return to my conception and turn on the lights, to explain to the disheveled lovers why making me was a mistake. I had to exist already. Fairy, slight and with incandescent wings, appears. She carries a child's guitar. Fairy, I can make it so you exist. I can grant that wish, but it comes with a condition. Man, to exist, I must exit the stage. Is that it? Is that the condition? Fairy, yes, if you exist, you must use your existence to erase every worldly trace of yourself, and you must start by exiting this stage. Man, but what will the audience do once I've exited? Fairy, singing and playing her guitar. At first, they will remember you vaguely, as though your voice were drowned out by gossipers at a cocktail party, and with it, the details of your plot. Then they will hear only rumors of you, which, since they seem so bizarre, they will ascribe to innuendo. Then only silence where you were. Man, and this process will take how long? Fairy, you will not know until you are finished it, and when you are finished it, you won't know. Man, why should I be created just to undo my creation? Fairy, this is a common question and unanswerable. Man, As a child, I had a stuffed dolphin. I carried it with me everywhere. I think what I would like now is a symbol to carry around with me in my mind. Can I choose a symbol just to make the process easier? I'm scared. I think if I had a symbol, I would not be so scared. Fairy, playing her guitar. Your symbol is the Ferris wheel that gobbles its own tail, the peaceful circle, the serene return to origin and out again, as though the return never happened, the journey undoing the return undoing the journey, the pattern made from the pattern it traces, a pattern that by tracing it, it erases. Man. My children loved the Ferris wheel in Paris. We shared a cramped car with a piano teacher from Lyon. You had a feeling that the world was wide, that people went to such beautiful lengths to abate each other's misery. On the Ferris wheel, I can remember thinking, how odd that I'm thinking not about the Paris skyline, which I had never seen, though I was 39, but about the Paris Ferris wheel, a principle of human self-obsession that has many hazards, but at that moment, riding the Ferris wheel, not at all interested in the Champs or Notre Dame, it felt like an affirmation of what is really human. I thought of community theater for some reason. I had a deep wish that someday my boys would play Clara in a drag version of the Nutcracker. The weird things people do to make each other happy. Not each other, no. To make the human race average out happy, so we break even in the long run with pain. And my children smiling beside me. And the piano teacher took our picture. We represented to her what she represented to us, some potential breadth in human empathy, a break from the loneliness mid-century plays describe, a way to think of children without sentimentality, and more importantly, of strangers just as they are in a shared Ferris wheel car and without metaphysical cliche. Fairy. Empathy is hard. It paralyzes people. You should indulge it only occasionally. The result is the same either way. Your work must be tireless and even, I'm sorry, a little pitiless. Man. So now I must exit the stage. Fairy. Now you must exit the stage. Man hesitates a moment. Fairy starts weeping uncontrollably, her tiny body heaving in deep sobs as she repeats, "I'm sorry, oh God, I'm sorry," in a voice the audience suddenly realizes is intimately familiar to the man. The man comforts her awkwardly. It is as though they have known one another for many years, as though this were the culmination of many moments between them. The man is torn between his desire to comfort his dear friend and his wish not to appear to the audience to know her personally. As her sadness deepens, his self-consciousness grows. Now everyone surely can see that they are lovers. He wishes they could perform the entire play over from beginning to end. He can see that he broke character. He thinks that if he can stay in character himself, maybe this once he could keep her in character. He wishes to start the play over. Fairy grants man his wish. The stage goes dark. The lights come on. An empty stage. Man stands at the front of the stage. The end. Thank you.
Well, I'm next, and I thought I would risk the riots I'm told would break out in the streets if I don't read Lied Goldkorn for the first time in many years. This is a beginning of a new project, a novel about the making of a movie and the making of a war. And interspersed throughout, there are short scenes with Jack L. Warner, the head of Warner Brothers. This scene is narrated by Abdul Marjan. Abdul was perhaps the man that, maybe the only man that Jack really loved in his life. He was a Turkish boxer who became Jack's masseur, private masseur. You can look him up. He was in a couple of movies. He was called the Terrible Turk. That was his ring name when he boxed. And he was also very fond of Jack, and when he died, he left all his belongings to Jack. The only other thing you have to know, this is set in April 1942, immediately after Jack Warner has gotten his colonel's uniform in the U.S. Air Force, which is true. He did become one to join the effort in World War II. He's just put his uniform on. They've come out of the wardrobe department. One of the characters, whose name is Rido Loshak. Rido was a famous costume designer at Warner Brothers. Everything else is pretty self-explanatory. The things that the Epstein brothers say in the course of this, they actually said in life. So April 1942. This is Abdul speaking. We all followed the chief, or maybe now I should call him the colonel, from the wardrobe department and out of doors. It was a nice spring day in the valley, a blue sky with what in Anatolia we call horsetail clouds. The chief, as soon as he got outside, put his hand up to the visor of his cap and stared up at the sky. It was a habit he had developed, not to look at the clouds, but for the bombers and fighters of the Japs. We were right in line with the aircraft plants in Burbank, which is why he had the set painters splash a big sign and an arrow on top of one of the sound stages. Lockheed that-a-way. It was a gag, naturally, except it wasn't. Not really. He actually did that. Anyhow, who should come past the guardhouse of the main gate but Julius J. Epstein and his brother Phil? This, for the chief, was worse than a flight of zeros. He stopped short. So did the twins. They looked at J.L. Warner, then they looked at each other. The two of their bald heads turned pink, like eggs we color at Easter. You could see that they were about to double up in laughter. Instead, they did the opposite. I mean, they stood up so straight they were bending backward, and as if they'd rehearsed it, saluted. Then they saluted again and were about to do it for the third time when the chief, his arms were already down at his side and twitching as if he were holding off an invisible whip, said, all right, knock it off." The boys, which is what everybody called them, simultaneously said, "Yes, sir, Colonel, yes, sir." "Lieutenant Colonel, damn it." Julie, scandalized. Didn't they tell him, Phil, that a colonel is higher? Just behind me, I could hear Miss Lancaster giggle. So did the two writers. One or the other of them, I could not tell which pea in the pod, said, "Hi there, Hadassah." What the hell's that supposed to mean? Well, just about everybody knew, even if the chief did not, that one of the boys had stolen a piece of stationery from his office. Last December, when Miss Lancaster arrived, she got a letter. Date, December 2nd, 1941. Subject, screen name. To Carolina Longa, from Jack L. Warner. Dear Miss Longa, this is just a brief note to welcome you into the Warner Brothers family. My brothers and I look forward to a long and fruitful association with you. We are certain that you will have a sparkling career under your new name, Hadassah Felberbaum. Regards to your mother in the old country, J.L. Warner, parentheses, please call me Jack. She's a very beautiful young woman. They copied his signature right down to the loop on the J and the swoop underneath. Caroline turned to the chief and said, well, I think to head off trouble, I called to one of the twins. Say, Julie, when are we going to have that fight? 5 rounds. It's all for the war bonds. Buy them and hold them. The terrible Turk is going to take both of you on at once. For war bonds, we'll do it, but one at a time. No, that wouldn't be fair. You only had 1 professional fight. Am I correct? That's right, said Julius J. It ended in a draw. Well, how come you quit? His brother chimed in. He wanted to retire undefeated. The two of them started in with the same kind of laughter, to my ear like the sound of crows. Haw, haw, haw. The chief all the time was frowning down at his watch. Do you two have any idea what time it is? Let me be the first to tell you. 2:02. Thank you, Jack. We had no idea. I'll give you an additional piece of information. Your contract says you have to be in your office and at work by 9 a.m. You aren't fooling anybody. I know damn well you stroll in after lunch every damn day. Don't you know we're trying to get out a picture? Right now, we're on our way to test Miss Lancaster, and we don't even have the lines for her to speak. But at least she's working. I'm working. Rido here is working too. What makes you so special? I'm getting tired of it. What are you doing? Playing tennis at Roxbury? Don't lie to me, we got our spies. We weren't playing tennis, Jack, but we do need a 4th this Sunday, and God damn it, I'm getting worked up. A butcher shows up at a butcher shop at 9. A clerk sits down at his desk at 9 o'clock too. Even bank presidents start work at 9. Fine, said Julie, or maybe it was Phil. Then why don't you hire a bank president to finish the script? I'll tell the jokes around here. As of today, this stops. I'm going to tell the guardhouse to write down whenever you two come in and send me a report. After 2 o'clock, and with a war on. Well, we'd have been in sooner except that Hal told us to go over to Culver City. What the hell for? They got better courts over there? Didn't he tell you? We're trying to talk Selznick into loaning us Bergman for the picture. Selznick, said the chief, looking up at the sky once more, but this time for inspiration. Bergman. Little Rido came forward and whispered something in the colonel's ear. Oh yeah, Ingrid. Well, what happened? Make it snappy. The Epstein started in. Each one speaks a separate line here. He was eating lunch, right at his desk. Soup, tomato soup, with a spoon. For Christ's sakes, why don't you tell me what he had for breakfast while you're at it? What the hell happened? Well, we told him all about the picture, how there's this American saloon keeper in Morocco, and his old girlfriend shows up, and the letters of transit, and the Germans are putting pressure on the Vichy officials, and not once does he look up from his soup, but he just keeps spooning it in as if we weren't there at all. So finally, Phil said, it's just a lot of slick shit like Algiers. And he puts down his spoon and lifts up his head and says, okay, you can have her. I want de Havilland in return. Jack says, de Havilland? Once more, Rido went up on tiptoes and whispered in his ear, oh yeah, right, okay, you can have her. Great, said Julius J. Now we know who to write Ilse's lines for. From the shadow that passed over the chief's face, you'd have thought that much bigger clouds had moved over the sun. And from the way he grabbed Miss Lancaster's arm and tried to pull her away, you'd have thought it was about to rain. But the Fraulein stood her ground. Ilse, she said, isn't that my part? Weren't we going to test for it now? Uh-oh, said Phil. You said it, said Julie. The chief turned on the two of them. Now look what you've done. Loose lips, said one of the twins. Sink ships, said the other. I might make it loose hips, sink ships. I think that might be better. Miss Lancaster yanked her arm from the chief's grip. Don't you, Miss Lancaster yanked her arm from the chief's grips. Don't you touch me. The perfect face, you said, the perfect accent, is no different here than in the Third Reich, but at least Herr Goebbels keeps his word. I would have been Annalie if I'd stayed, the model for the German woman. Rido, the costume man, said, you don't mean that, darling. You're in a free country now. Suddenly the girl burst into tears. If it was an act, then in my opinion she deserved an Academy Award. They came spurting out of her. Rain after all. The chief put his arm with the oak leaf cluster on the sleeve around her. Stop it. I can't stand crying. If you don't stop, I'll start crying too. But that seemed to make it worse. Look, there was a misunderstanding. The left hand, you know, doesn't listen to the right. I'll give that Wallace a real dressing down, that son of a bitch. Whose name is on this water tower anyway? A W and an A and a... That's as far as this spelling as could get. You've got to stop crying. Didn't you hear there's a drought? Please, I'm on my knees, so to speak. Don't worry. Look how beautiful you are. And listen to you. What acting. You just passed your screen test. We've got another part for you, a great part. That seemed to grab her attention. The chief looked around desperately at the Epstein twins. Right, boys? Then, with what they call in the business sotto voce, right, God damn it? Sure, there's this foreign refugee, a Bulgarian, a Romanian, from Croatia maybe. What the hell does it matter where she's from as long as she's got an accent? This is perfect for Caroline. She's beautiful, okay? With a neck and a figure, a knockout, young, vivacious, lost in a foreign land. Do you hear that, sweetheart? It's practically written for you. Here's how I see it. How you have suffered, fleeing for your life from the Nazis. It's absolutely heartrending. 4 handkerchiefs. Then thank God this happened. I see the hand of Providence. Fräulein Caroline Lange, she was going to be a model for all German women. But now Miss Caroline Lancaster, Miss Caroline Lancaster. He paused. It was like the imaginary clouds had parted. You could see the sunbeams on his face and the way they bounced off his teeth. She'll be the symbol of all German victims, the persecuted, the nameless, the hunted. All right, my sweet? Everything okay now? You are the hope. You are the dream for all the wretched of the earth. Behind his back, the 2 writers pantomimed, clapping their hands together. And to tell the truth, at this performance, I almost broke into applause myself. Thank you. Actually, one other little story while people are sitting down, I think you should. Was this an athletic club or something? Just once Julian Phil handed, after this conversation, handed Jack a script that he hated, thought was awful, the worst thing he ever read, and he told him, he says, this is awful, it's terrible, worst thing I ever read, how dare you hand me a piece of crap like this? And my father said, I don't understand it, Jack. We wrote it at 9. Next, we have, you all aware, I'm sure, that Louise Glick's last book is being widely reviewed and praised anywhere. Wherever she has been and wherever she goes, honors are heaped upon her. And what an honor for our program that she's part of it. Louise Glick.
Very funny. Thank you. I think it, well, never mind. Never feels like that's what you're getting. I'm going to read a couple of new poems. The first poem that I'll read is from the middle of a very long poem, about 22 pages long. It's an account, first-person account of the difficulty in an artist's life of those periods of failure to work. The poem itself begins with a baby talking about the baby is a boy. He seems to be gay. his infancy and a bizarre incident that happens in which he, after a period of beginning to speak, can't speak. This is from the middle of the poem, and it, as you'll see, reviews the preceding sections. It's called Afterword. Reading what I have just written, I now believe I stopped precipitously so that my story seems to have been slightly distorted, ending as it did, not abruptly, but in a kind of artificial mist of the sort sprayed onto stages to allow for difficult set changes. Why did I stop? Did some instinct discern a shape? The artist in me intervening to stop traffic, as it were? A shape, or fate, as the poets say, intuited in those few long ago hours. I must have thought so once. And yet I dislike the term, which seems to me a crutch, a phase, the adolescence of the mind, perhaps. Still, it was a term I used myself frequently to explain my failures. Fate, destiny, whose designs and warnings now seem to me simply local symmetries, metonymic baubles within immense confusion. Chaos was what I saw. My brush froze. I could not paint it. Darkness, silence. That was the feeling. What did we call it then? A crisis of vision, corresponding, I believed, to the tree that confronted my parents, but whereas they were forced forward into the obstacle, I retreated or fled. Mist covered the stage, my life. Characters came and went, costumes were changed. My brush hand moved side to side, far from the canvas, side to side like a windshield wiper. Surely this was the desert, the dark night. In reality, a crowded street in London, the tourists waving their colored maps. One speaks a word, I. Out of this stream the great forms. I took a deep breath, and it came to me the person who drew that breath was not the person in my story, his childish hand confidently wielding the crayon. Had I been that person? A child, but also an explorer to whom the path is suddenly clear, for whom the vegetation parts, and beyond, no longer screened from view, that exalted solitude Kant perhaps experienced on his way to the bridges. We share a birthday. Outside, the festive streets were strung in late January with exhausted Christmas lights. A woman leaned against her lover's shoulder, singing Jacques Brel in her thin soprano. Bravo, the door is shut. Now nothing escapes, nothing entered. I had moved. I felt the desert stretching ahead, stretching, it now seems, on all sides, shifting as I speak, so that I was constantly face to face with blankness, that stepchild of the sublime, which it turns out has been both my subject and my medium. What would my twin have said had my thoughts reached him? Perhaps he would have said, in my case, there was no obstacle for the sake of argument, after which I would have been referred to religion, the cemetery where questions of faith are answered. The mist had cleared. The empty canvases were turned inward against the wall. The little cat is dead, so the song went. Shall I be raised from death? The spirit asks. And the sun says, yes. And the desert answers, your voice is sand scattered in wind. The melancholy assistant. This is not from that poem. I had an assistant, but he was melancholy. So melancholy it interfered with his duties. He was to open my letters, which were few, and answer those that required answers, leaving a space at the bottom for my signature. And under my signature, his own initials, in which formality at the outset he took great pride. When the phone rang, he was to say his employer was at the moment occupied and offered to convey a message. After several months, he came to me. "Master," he said, which was his name for me, "I have become useless to you. You must turn me out." And I saw that he had packed his bags and was prepared to go, though it was night and the snow was falling. My heart went out to him. "Well," I said, "if you cannot perform these few duties, what can you do?" And he pointed to his eyes, which were full of tears. "I can weep," he said. "Then you must weep for me," I told him, "as Christ wept for mankind." Still, he was hesitant. "Your life is enviable," he said. "What must I think of when I cry?" And I told him of the emptiness of my days, and of time which was running out, and of the meaninglessness of my achievement. And as I spoke, I had the odd sensation of once more feeling something for another human being. He stood completely still. I had lit a small fire in the fireplace. I remember hearing the contented murmurs of the dying logs. "Master," he said, "you have given meaning to my suffering." It was a strange moment. The whole exchange seemed both deeply fraudulent and profoundly true, as though such words as emptiness and meaninglessness had stimulated some remembered emotion which now attached itself to this occasion and person. His face was radiant. His tears glinted red and gold in the firelight. Then he was gone. Outside, the snow was falling, the landscape changing into a series of bland generalizations, marked here and there with enigmatic shapes where the snow had drifted. The street was white. The various trees were white. Changes of the surface. But is that not really all we ever see? And one more poem in 5 short parts. A Summer Garden. 1. Several weeks ago, I discovered a photograph of my mother sitting in the sun, her face flushed as with achievement or triumph. The sun was shining. The dogs were sleeping at her feet, where time was also sleeping, calm and unmoving as in all photographs. I wiped the dust from my mother's face. Indeed, dust covered everything. It seemed to me the persistent haze of nostalgia that protects all relics of childhood. In the background, an assortment of park furniture, trees, and shrubbery. The sun moved lower in the sky, the shadows lengthened and darkened. The more dust I removed, the more these shadows grew. Summer arrived. The children leaned over the rose border, their shadows merging with the shadows of the roses. A word came into my head, referring to this shifting and changing, these erasures that were now obvious. It appeared and as quickly vanished. Was it blindness or darkness, peril, confusion? Summer arrived, then autumn, the leaves turning, the children bright spots in a mash of bronze and sienna. 2. When I had recovered somewhat from these events, I replaced the photograph as I had found it between the pages of an ancient paperback, many parts of which had been annotated in the margins, sometimes in words, but more often in spirited questions and exclamations meaning, I agree, or I'm unsure, puzzled. The ink was faded. Here and there, I couldn't tell what thoughts occurred to the reader, but through the bruise-like blotches, I could sense urgency as though tears had fallen. I held the book a while. It was Death in Venice in translation. I had noted the page in case, as Freud believed, nothing is an accident. Thus, the little photograph was buried again, as the past is buried in the future. In the margin, there were 2 words linked by an arrow, sterility, and down the page, oblivion. And it seemed to him the pale and lovely summoner out there smiled at him and beckoned. 3. How quiet the garden is. No breeze ruffles the cornelian cherry. Summer has come. How quiet it is now that life has triumphed. The rough pillars of the sycamores support the immobile shelves of the foliage, the lawn beneath lush, iridescent, and in the middle of the sky, the immodest God. Things are, he says. They are, they do not change. Response does not change. How hushed it is. The stage as well as the audience, it seems, breathing is an intrusion. He must be very close. The grass is shadowless. How quiet it is. How silent, like an afternoon in Pompeii. 4. Mother died last night, mother who never dies. Winter was in the air, many months away, but in the air nevertheless. It was the 10th of May. Hyacinth and apple blossom bloomed in the back garden. We could hear Maria singing songs from Czechoslovakia. How alone I am, songs of that kind. How alone I am, no mother, no father. My brain seems very empty without them. Aromas drifted out of the earth. The dishes were in the sink, rinsed but not stacked. Under the full moon, Maria was folding the washing. The stiff sheets became dry white rectangles of moonlight. How alone I am, but in music, my desolation is my rejoicing. It was the 10th of May, as it had been the 9th, the 8th. Mother slept in her bed, her arms outstretched, her head balanced between them. 5. Beatrice took the children to the park in Cedarhurst. The sun was shining. Airplanes passed back and forth overhead, peaceful because the war was over. It was the world of her imagination. True and false were of no importance. Freshly polished and glittering, that was the world. Dust had not yet erupted on the surface of things. The planes passed back and forth, bound for Rome and Paris. You couldn't get there unless you flew over the park. Everything must pass through. Nothing can stop. The children held hands, leaning to smell the roses. They were 5 and 7. Infinite, infinite, that was her perception of time. She sat on a bench, somewhat hidden by oak trees. Far away, fear approached and departed. From the train station came the sound it made. The sky was pink and orange. older because the day was over. There was no wind. The summer day cast oak-shaped shadows on the green grass. Thank you.
One of the things that we're proudest of about our program is how various and international it is. As I think many of you know, we send our students, the last 2 years, all of them, out into the world wherever they want to go to do whatever they want to do for up to 3 months. And we also draw in students from all over the world. The person who's going to read next, the young lady who's going to read next, was in last year's class. And last year's class, half the members of the class, of the 10, were from foreign lands. From Cuba, someone who escaped on a boat as a youth. From Ukraine, 2 from India, and then from South Korea, Sue herself from South Korea. That's not atypical. Sigrid and I and Hajin have just been reading the 30 top people for next year's class of the 250 in fiction for the next class, and they're from everywhere, everywhere. And a good number will be coming, I think. So the reason I pick Sue in particular is not only is she a fine writer, but she wrote gems, beautiful, small gems that fit this format perfectly, I think, and as you're about to hear. So now, Sue Yeon Hong from South Korea and many places in America too. Sue.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be reading here because a year ago I helped Caroline stuff the envelope, the invitation envelope, and wondered, you know, maybe in 15 years I'll be here reading, perhaps, if I write a lot. But since I got the invitation from Leslie, I said, okay, this is going to be like another workshop. I'm going to write another story to make, you know, Leslie and the program proud. Well, that was too much pressure for me. I couldn't do it. I tried hard, but in the end, I decided to read the first story I wrote for Leslie. Dandelions. Mina took the 6:20 New York City-bound bus from Syracuse that morning. When she arrived at JFK, Korean Air 767 had already landed. She found her in-laws waiting in the baggage claim area. Mrs. Cho squatting down next to her luggage, nibbling a rice cake, and Mr. Cho circling around his wife with his hands at his back. The empty conveyor belt rotated idly behind them. "Kwon-mina," Mrs. Cho said, standing up. "I thought you had abandoned us." "Why would she do such a thing?" Mr. Cho said. Mrs. Chu looked around. "Is my son parking the car?" "He couldn't come," Mina said. "The dean invited doctoral students to lunch." "The dean?" Mrs. Cho said. "The dean of the college?" "Yes." "That's very good. My son shouldn't miss such a thing." "So you learn to drive on the highway?" Mr. Cho asked. "We'll go by Amtrak." Junho said the train ride is very comfortable and the view quite nice. "If my son says so," Mrs. Cho said. Mina had never heard her mother-in-law call Junho by his name. She called him my son, and her 3 daughters, my daughters, and Mina by her full name. That was not the only thing she found odd about her mother-in-law. Shortly after Mina married Junho, she noticed his hand resting on his mother's breast while they were watching a television drama. "She's my mother," he had said in defense when Mina told him how strange it was for a mother to let her grown-up son do such a thing. Mina brushed off the incident as something only the youngest child would do. Mina had tried to get her in-laws seats on the riverside of the train, but they were all taken. Luckily, she found 2 seats together and one 3 rows up. Mrs. Cho insisted that she and Mina sit together. "I want to hear what you've been up to," Mrs. Cho said. "You look like you've lost weight." "I've been doing yoga." "I'm glad you're looking after yourself. It's hard, isn't it, taking care of a student husband?" She squeezed Mina's hand. "But it's over now. You will soon be the wife of a professor. You should thank your aunt." Mina's aunt had introduced Junho to her 3 years before, when he was home for summer break. His mother was eager to find him a wife before he went back to Syracuse for his 2nd year of graduate school. And Mina's parents were also in a rush to find their oldest daughter a husband. As the train rolled out from underground into the bright afternoon, Mrs. Cho leaned forward to see the view on the other side of the aisle. "What river is that?" "The Hudson," Mina said. And even though it was much wider than the Han, it reminded her of home. "And the Niagara Falls is at the end of it?" "I don't know. I haven't been there." "Didn't you two visit?" "Juno is not," Mina said, searching for the word, "romantic." "You can't blame him if you don't tell him what you want." Did I say I blamed him? Of course not. You have to give him a chance to be romantic if you want him to be romantic. I wish he were more like his father. "His father? Romantic?" Mrs. Cho laughed. "But didn't he marry you even though his parents..." "That had nothing to do with him being romantic." Mrs. Cho looked out the window for a moment before closing her eyes and falling asleep. Mina rubbed her finger against the armrest until it burned. She studied her mother-in-law's face. Her nose was flat and her skin blotchy like her husband's. Mina wondered what her father-in-law saw in his wife. Juno told Mina that his father had married his mother despite his family's disapproval. Mina had found the story lovely. Her parents had been strangers when they married. On her way back from the restroom, Mina stopped at her father-in-law's seat. The man sitting next to him was listening to his Walkman and shaking his head. The music was loud, and his duffel bag leaned against Mr. Cho's leg. "Should I ask him to move his bag?" Mina said. "It doesn't bother me. Do they sell beer in the snack car?" He wiped the sweat off his face with his handkerchief. "A cold beer would be very nice." "I'm sure they do, but the conductor said it wouldn't be open for another hour or 2. She checked the ceiling vent. No air was coming out. "Why don't you take off your jacket? I'll put it up in the overhead compartment." "Would you do that?" She helped him take his jacket off. He had been the principal at an all-boys high school for 30 years. His students had given him 2 round-trip tickets to anywhere in the world as a retirement gift, and he had saved them for this visit, to attend his son's graduation. "Is your mother-in-law doing all right?" "She's taking a nap." "Good. You must be tired too. What time did you leave Syracuse this morning?" "I slept on the bus." Both her in-laws were asleep when the train arrived in Albany Rensselaer. The conductor announced they would stop for 15 minutes. Mina stepped outside onto the platform to get some fresh air. Nearby, a man and a woman were smoking. The man wore a leather vest, exposing dragon tattoos on his shoulders and arms, and the woman played with her tangled hair and laughed between drags on her cigarette. Mina nudged some cigarette butts that were scattered on the edge of the platform onto the tracks. She looked up at the overcast sky and wondered whether it was going to rain. She went into the waiting area and called her husband. He had insisted she call him in Albany. "Are my parents doing okay? They must be exhausted." "They're fine. They're sleeping." "I'm sure they appreciate what you're doing. They like you a lot, you know." "I have to go. The train's leaving." She put the receiver down, but picked it up again and made another call. The phone rang 3 times. She closed her eyes and imagined David rolling over and reaching for the phone on his bedside table. Hello? He answered in his low voice. Hello? He repeated, Mina? She hung up and went back to the train. Her mother-in-law was awake. Where have you been? To call Junho and let him know the train is on time. There were a lot of people getting in and out of the train. Do you think our suitcases are safe up there? Mrs. Cho rose from her seat to check on them in the storage area at the front of the car. I keep an eye on them, Mina said. I brought dried persimmons. They're in the luggage. One of your father-in-law's students brought them last New Year's, and I've been saving them for you. For me? I tried to mail them to you before, but the postal clerk said you can't send fruit overseas. You didn't know? Mina shook her head. She had craved persimmons when she was pregnant, but Junho couldn't find them anywhere in Syracuse. And it was all right to bring them in your luggage? I left the customs form blank. Mrs. Cho giggled into her hand. But I'm not pregnant. Your husband asked me to bring them for the future. I will not want them again. I know you're upset, but you're young. You still have time. I'm not upset. Mina got up. Where are you going? To the restroom. After buying a bag of Cheez-Its and a Budweiser, Mina sat by herself at a table in the dining car and looked out the window at a backyard with kids riding plastic toy cars. They waved. She waved back, even though they couldn't see her. She never understood why people drank beer. It tasted like barley tea mixed with club soda. 2 weeks before, David had told her that he didn't believe in serious relationships. I made it very clear from the beginning, he had said. Mina finished her beer and ordered another one. Is that all, miss? The man behind the bar asked. I'm closing. Then I'll have 2. On her way back to her seat, the train lurched forward, then came to a halt. The lights flickered out. A conductor rushed by, almost knocking her over. What happened? A passenger asked. Did we hit something? The conductor ignored the question and disappeared into the next car. Mina didn't realize the sun was about to set until she looked outside. All she saw were trees. Her mother-in-law was sleeping, but her father-in-law craned his neck out into the aisle and waved at her. The man sitting next to him had left. Why did the train stop? Mr. Cho asked. His breath smelled sour. Or maybe it was hers, she couldn't tell. I don't know, Mina said, covering her mouth. Sit with me. He slid to the window seat. The train was so quiet that she could hear the rustling of his pants against the cushion. She perched on the edge of the seat, holding her head. Had I known what a trouble it was for you to come all the way to New York City, we would have come by ourselves. When I return home, I'll thank your parents. They have raised you well. Mina buried her face in her hands and cried. Of course, you missed them. Mina woke up to the announcement that another train would arrive shortly. Mrs. Cho was sitting next to her instead of Mr. Cho. Mina looked out the window. Everything was hidden in darkness. How long did I sleep? About 2 hours. I'm glad you had some rest. When the other train finally arrived, Mina and Mrs. Cho stood in line and waited their turn to switch cars. This reminds me of a train ride I had with my family a long time ago, Mrs. Cho said. We were fleeing from the communists, and every time the conductor saw flashes of light in the distance, he turned off the engine and told us to get off and lie under the car until it was safe. Sometimes we had to stay that way for 3-4 hours. One time, my father was missing, and I was so worried that he had fallen asleep under the train. But at the last minute, just as the car started to move, he appeared, carrying a bouquet of dandelions, and handed them to my mother. That's lovely, Mina said. Lovely? My father was a fool, risking everything for some old flowers. I'm sure your mother appreciated it. I wish Junho were romantic like your father. He left my mother after the war. Mina gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. When Mr. and Mrs. Cho had changed seats 2 hours earlier, after the train had stopped, Mina had murmured in her sleep, "He doesn't love me." Mrs. Cho heard those words and knew Mina was not talking about her son. So she decided to tell the story. Everything about it was true, except for the dandelions. Thank you.
And Sue was reading that from the journal in which it's been published. So, thanks, Sue. I think one of the reasons we're so successfully an international program is that Ha-Jin is part of it. Many students rightly want to study with him. His work has an international impact. All the books are translated into many languages, and in fact, I think his last book, Nanjing Requiem, is a bestseller in China. Is that right? He doesn't get the money, that's right. But for me, and I think for the program, it's Ha-Jin, the writer, Ha-Jin, the teacher, and I think we're lucky enough to know Ha-Jin, the man, that we so much appreciate. Ha-Jin.
Thank you. I'm going to read from a novel I've been working on titled A Map of Betrayal. This is about a Chinese spy who came to the United States and lived in the country for many years, eventually died here. And the narrator of this novel is his daughter, an American woman, who is a history professor in Maryland. But the novel has two stories. One is her own, told in the first person, the process of her rediscovering her father's first family back in China. And the other story is her father's story, told in the third person, but in the same voice, her voice. Because she's a history professor, now she's trying to reconstruct her father's story. And this is the moment her father had been now, by this point, he had been with an American intelligence unit agency in Okinawa for some years. This is the first time he returned to China. He planned to go back to see his family, but he was frustrated. And so I'm going to start at the lunch where he met his handler, who is also his friend. I'm going to read from the middle of the lunch. A ferry boat blew its horn like a mooing cow, chugging away from the waterside and dragging a frothy wake. Bing Wen said, "You are from Shandong, so we are having dumplings for this welcome home lunch." "Thanks. When can I go back? You know, I haven't seen my family for 5 years." "Ah, that's another matter I'm supposed to discuss with you." Bing Wen smiled cunningly, his hawk eyes rolling, as if to check whether the other 7 or 8 diners were eavesdropping. They were all out of earshot. He said to Gary, "Your family is fine. We've been taking good care of them. Can I go back to see my folks just for a short visit?" "No, you cannot, because the moment you cross the border, the Brits will inform the Yanks about you, and that will blow your cover. The party wants you to stay with the U.S. agency in Okinawa and to gather as much intelligence as you can. For this mission, your identity must be kept secret. Brother, I know this is hard on you, for you. You've been making tremendous sacrifice for our country. For that, you have our highest respect. Hearing that, Gary felt touched, but also disarmed, unable to push his request anymore. A dull pain seized his heart again, while a hot lump was swelling his throat. He lowered his eyes and asked, what if the agency moves back to the United States? There has been talk about that. Go with them. That's the instructions from above. Gary frowned, breathing hard as though something was stuck in his esophagus. Look, I'm going to be 30 in a month, and this celibate life isn't easy for me. His voice took on a watching note. I won't say I miss my wife terribly like a newlywed. My parents picked her out for me, but I feel bad, guilty. I shouldn't have treated Yufeng this way. Besides, I miss home. We know Yufeng is a good woman. She understands you've been doing an indispensable service to our country. As for your personal life, Bing-wen blinked meaningfully and gave a tight smile. The higher-ups deliberated that too. If necessary, you should consider starting another family abroad. This also means you must prepare to live overseas for many years. So mine is a protracted mission? That's right. Gary was stunned, then managed to say, okay, I understand. He came within a breath of protesting, but realized that would only make matters worse and might jeopardize his family. He heaved a sigh, unable to fathom the full implications of the directive. Much as he was happy to see his friend plus handler, the welcome home lunch felt like a letdown. In addition to the $500 in the envelope, Bing-wen notified Gary that he had been promoted to rank 18, the same as a first lieutenant in the Army. From now on, he would earn 2 salaries a month, $230 from the American agency and 74 yuan, about $60 from the payroll of China's Ministry of National Security. He was sure that few of his comrades were paid so well. That lessened his despondency a little. If he lived frugally and saved some greenbacks, someday he'd be able to return home a wealthy man. Still, hard as he tried, he couldn't reason away his misery. Hong Kong was warm in February, and there was a scent of spring in the air. The streets were overflowing with pedestrians, and many of them in rags, apparently refugees from the inland. Oh, by the way, this was in 1954. Yet few wore country-padded clothes or heavy coats as people did in the north. Walking back to his hotel, Gary heard pigeons cooing and raised his head to look around, but he didn't see any bird. Instead, he saw colored laundry fluttering on bamboo poles stretched between the rails of balconies. Along the street, endless sharp signs, emblazoned with characters, swayed like tattered banners. A uniformed Indian guard appeared, standing at the entrance to a grand stone building, his head turbaned and his beard trimmed. The air was musty and felt a little sticky. Summer can be insufferable here, Gary thought. Perhaps more sultry than Okinawa. A small boy in a patched gown accosted him, stretching out his carpet hand, but Gary recognized him. On his way to lunch, he'd given this same beggar 2 coins, so he shoot him away. An old woman was leaping over from the opposite direction, holding an oil paper umbrella under her arm. A rickshaw caught up with her to see if she needed a ride, but she waved it off. As Gary was nearing a street crossing, a midnight blue Rolls-Royce with chrome lights and bumpers emerged, honking petulantly while the pedestrians jumped aside to make way. Still, the sedan spattered muddy water on some people, and on the stands selling hot soy milk, magazines, flowers, fruits, deep-fried fish balls. A middle-aged woman in green slacks and rubber boots brandished her arms while yelling at the rear of the car, "Damn you, foreign devils!" Gary had only seen the Chinese chauffeur and another Asian face in the Rolls-Royce, but he was sure it was a foreign car, as the UK flag on its fender showed. This reminded him that he'd been engaged in fighting imperialism. Yet, yes, China had to drive all the colonial powers off its soil, and he'd better quit indulging in self-pity and fretting about his personal gain and loss. He ought to be more devoted to the cause of liberating the whole country. He stopped to pick up the South China Morning Post, which he'd found gave more coverage of international events than Chinese-language newspapers. During the rest of his vacation, he tried to enjoy himself and felt entitled to spend a bit of money. He dined at restaurants that offered northern food and frequented some bars where he developed a taste for fruit juices, some of which he hadn't tasted before. He liked mango puree, pineapple smoothie, kiwi slush, squeezed guava juice. Restless with the stirring and with a knot of lust tightening in his belly, he even went to some nightclubs where girls danced provocatively, their red flapper dresses flaring out from their waists. At one of the clubs, he picked up a 20-something, speaking only English to her, partly because he'd been instructed never to disclose his mainland background, and partly because he meant to impress her with his U.S. background, U.S. affiliation. The women of mixed blood, Brazilian and Cantonese, called him American Chinaman when they were both tipsy. She kept calling him that even in his hotel room. As if suddenly liberated, he felt a kind of transformation taking place in him, and during the rest of his vacation, he wouldn't hesitate to seek pleasure, as though he meant to drop a cracked pot again and again, just for the madness of it. He knew that once he returned to Okinawa, he would become the tame, quiet clerk again. Aware that this kind of dissipation might deform his personality and lead to a disaster, he made a vow that after his 30th birthday, on March 12th, he would stop indulging himself. Before Gary's vacation was over, Bing Wen gave him a lavish dinner at Four Seas Pavilion, a send-off attended by just the two of them. He told Gary that he should try to work his way up the ladder in the U.S. intelligence system. He needn't collect every piece of useful information and should gather only what he considered vital to China's interest and security. If possible, he should come to Hong Kong once a year so they could catch up and make plans. From now on, he'd have an account at Hengshan Bank and the reward money would be deposited into it routinely. You are our hero on the invisible front, Bingwen told Gary in total earnest. A nameless hero, he said with a tinge of irony. That was the glorious term used publicly to denote a red spy. Brother, I can't say how much I sympathize with you, but I know this. You must feel like living in captivity all the time, like a caged tiger. If I were in your shoes, I would crack up and die of homesickness. Thanks for understanding, Gary said. His comrade's words dissolved his bitterness a little. He swallowed. Again, the pain was shooting up his throat. He wanted to say he might be out of element once he landed in America, but thought better of it. He wouldn't want Bingwen to report to his words back to their superiors, in whose eyes Gary was reluctant to devalue himself. Bingwen resumed, "Please always remember that China has raised you and appreciates your service and sacrifice. I shall keep that in mind." They lifted their short cups and drowned the West Phoenix. The strong liquor was making Gary giddy and teary. They polished a whole bottle of it. Thank you.
Well, here's a tip. If you want a real treat, you should go out and read the fiction and nonfiction of our next speaker, Sigrid Nunez. It's something that our students, and it's more than a treat, it's a deep pleasure and real enlightenment. And it's something that our students experience because we teach her book in our courses. Ha-Jin teaches it every year. I'm very pleased that she's going to be back with us again next year as well. So Sigrid Nunez.
I'm reading a short story called Worried Sisters. Our sister has always caused us grief. A dyspeptic baby, a nervous, accident-prone little girl, abnormally, so we at least thought, even if the doctor pooh-poohed this, sensitive to germs. Sneezing and hacking through every winter, and where we lived, winters were long. Everything went into her mouth. Take your eyes off her one instant, and she'd surely hang or choke or poison herself. Twice it ended in the emergency room. It was all we could do to pull her through childhood. Not a lovable child, but we loved her, of course. She was our sister. As she grew bigger, her problems grew too. She might have been a difficult, clumsy little girl, but at least she was happy. In her teens, she was never happy. The beauty of the family, to her own eyes, she was grotesque. She tortured her hair till it began to fall out, tortured her blemishes so that they left tiny scars. She ate too much and then too little, grew fat, grew thin, but of course, never thin enough. Once she punched a mirror into shards. Tears at the drop of a hat, rage at the merest suggestion of criticism. Countless absences from school. Not normal. This time, the doctor agreed. Now there would always be doctors in her life and medications, new kinds of which kept coming on the market, but none of which seemed to help. She wanted to be an artist, but why put it that way? Were we out to destroy her? She didn't want to be an artist, she was an artist. And it was true that she won a full scholarship to art school, that soon after graduation she was awarded a prestigious Young Artists Prize. But after this, encouraging signs were few. We could see for ourselves what a hard life it was, especially for one as sensitive to rejection and failure as she was. How would our baby ever survive? We tried to be supportive, turning the other cheek when she lashed out. We, with our ordinary lives and concerns, we who listened to the wrong bands and read the wrong books and made the mistake of calling paintings pictures, we could hardly be expected to understand her, nothing to do with blood. She often seemed just one long nose of disapproval. We confess that at times she scared us. In those days, she affected a drastic look, always in black, her dyed black hair stiffened into porcupine-like quills that said, "Back off or we'll shoot." She accused us of not caring whether she became a famous artist or not, and what could we say, since it was true? Nobody was more selfish or narcissistic than the male artist, she always said, but that was the only kind of man she went for, and always so recklessly that when the relationship fell apart, she fell apart too. And then it was just as it had been when she was a child. She had to be watched every minute. When she turned 40, she kept a promise she had made to herself at 30. She gave up her studio and stopped making art. She took a job as a fundraiser for a small local museum. Though we would never have told her so, this change gave us hope. For the first time, she began dating someone who was not an egotistical young buck of an artist, but a soft-spoken man a few years older than she, who worked for a company that sold office furniture. We could see how much our sister wanted things to work out. She tried not to compare her new boyfriend too much with the other, more exciting men she had been with, and to temper her disdain for his job. But the thought that she had settled for this man out of fear that she couldn't do better tormented her. He had no conversation, and certain personal habits that had always annoyed her turned out to be more than she could bear. One day she found a nail clipper and a pile of dirty toenails on the coffee table. Although she was sure she had made the right decision, the man was no sooner out of her life than she fell into her worst depression ever. Yet another new drug had recently become available, and her doctor urged her to try it. To everyone's surprise, it worked. Before our eyes, our sister passed from frantic despair to ordinary sadness. She got up every day and went to work. She ate, she slept, she went out with friends like any normal unhappy person. A year passed, during which we caught up on our sleep and our reading, finished various projects, and played with our grandchildren. And then one day, our sister ran into her old ditched boyfriend on her way home from work. Now they are back together again. In fact, she says, they have never gotten along so well. The things that bothered her the first time around, those habits that took such a toll on her nerves, they now roll right off her back. He is no longer a man who never has anything to say, but the strong, silent type. We see. We knew that this was one of the effects of the miracle drug, a mellowing effect, enabling the depressive for the first time in her life to take daily annoyances and simple frustrations in stride. Not till now, however, did we understand that another effect of the drug was to protect the depressive from this very knowledge. Not being medicated ourselves, and knowing our sister as we do, we can see clearly that if she were not taking the drug, her feelings for this man would be the same as they were before. We know it's the pills talking when she tells us how much she wants to get married. We have discussed the matter between ourselves, but never with our sister. We don't want her to be alone, but we are troubled by the thought of her marrying someone that she would never agree to marry if she were not on the medication. We don't like to think what might happen if for some reason she were to stop taking it. We are relieved that at least she is past having children. No children will suffer, whatever happens. However, the man in question is a fine, decent human being whom we have always liked, and we are uncomfortable with the idea of his making such a life-changing decision when he is lacking all the information. Together, we compose a letter to the columnist who answers questions from readers in various moral quandaries for our local newspaper. We explain that the doctor has said there is no reason our sister shouldn't be able to stay on the medication for the rest of her life. But we have also heard of studies that say this might not be possible. The medication could lose its effect over time, or staying on it for too long might turn out to be in some way harmful. This now has become our new worry. We take our responsibilities seriously, but we don't know what is the right thing to do, whether to speak now or forever hold our peace. We do not sign our real names, of course, but rather her loving sisters. Thank you.
As I told you. I see Robert is not wearing a skull cap tonight. I don't know why, but if he were, we could say that underneath that skull cap is the head that has conceived so many beautiful poems, has thought up so many ways to disseminate, improve, give poetry to the country and the wider world, who's done so much for our program. But the thing that I'd like to stress tonight is that although he's only 52 years old, he's just been presented with his 7th grandchild. Robert.
You'll be surprised to hear that the child is actually quite cute. I will, to please my brother Leslie, Leslie and I are often regarded as twins. To please him, I will read the poem I'll read to you tonight. I have a figurative skull cap on in the poem. And it is an honor and a pleasure and sort of restorative annually to realize that I am a colleague of these imaginations. I mean, this show of the diverse kinds of imagination that you've seen, and also with the students that these imaginations attract. The poem I'll read to you is called Poem with Refrains. The poem tells a kind of sad or miserable domestic personal story, and the refrains are there almost as a kind of, like in the pest house, it stinks and people took it. The meaning of the word nosegay, you take it and you smell through it. And the refrains are there just in a way to be beautiful and in contrast to the story. And the refrains are taken from the 16th century poetry that I love very much, and that the present students in my seminar are reading as part of our writing workshop. So appropriately to the Jewish stuff and to the 16th century, I will read this poem called Poem with Refrains. The opening scene. The yellow, coal-fed fog uncurling over the tainted city river. A young girl rowing and her anxious father scavenging for corpses. Or funeral meats. Or the clever abandoned orphan. Or the great athletic killer sulking in his tent, as though all stories began with someone dying. When her mother died, my mother refused to attend the funeral. In fact, she sulked in her tent all through the year of the old lady's dying. I don't know why. She said because she loved her mother so much she couldn't bear to see the way the doctors or her father or someone was letting her mother die. Follow your saint, follow with accents sweet, haste you, sad notes, fall at her flying feet. She fogs things up, she scavenges the taint. Possibly that's the reason I write these poems. But they did speak on the phone, wept and argued so fiercely one or the other often cut off a sentence by hanging up in rage, like lovers. But all that year, she never saw her face. They lived on the same block, 4 doors apart. Absence my presence is, strangeness my grace. With them that walk against me is my son. Synagogue is a word I never heard. We called it shul, the Yiddish word for school. Elms, terracotta, the ocean a few blocks east. Lay institution. She taught me we didn't think God lived in it. The rabbi, just a teacher. But what about the hereditary priests, descendants of the Kohanes of the temple, like Walter Holtz? I called him Uncle Walter when I was small. A big man with a face just like a boxer dog or a cartoon sergeant. She told me whenever Walter helped a pretty woman try on a shoe in his store, he'd touch her calf and ask her, "How does that feel?" I was too little to get the point, but pretended to understand. Desire, be steady. Hope is your delight, an orb wherein no creature can be sorry. She didn't go to my bar mitzvah either. I can't say why. She was there, and then she wasn't. I looked around before I mounted the steps to chant that babble and the speech that the rabbi wrote, and there she wasn't. And there was Uncle Walter, the Kohen, frowning with his doggy face, quote, "She's missing her own son's Musaf," end quote. Maybe she just doesn't like rituals. Afterwards, she had a reason I don't remember. I wasn't upset. The truth is, I had decided to be the clever orphan sometime before. By now, it's all a myth. What is a myth? But something that seems to happen always for the first time, over and over again. And 10 years later, she missed my brothers too. I'm sorry. I think it was something about a hat. Hot sun, cool fire, tempered with sweet air, black shade, fair nurse, shadow my white hair, shine, sun, burn, fire, breathe, air, and ease me. She sees the minister of the Nation of Islam on television, though she's half blind in one eye. His bow tie is lime, his jacket crocodile green. Vigorously, he denounces the Jews who traded in slaves, the Jews who run the newspapers and the banks. I see what this guy is mad about now, she says. It must have been some Jew that sold him the suit. And the same wind sang, and the same wave whitened, and or ever the garden's last petals were shed, in the lips that had whispered, the eyes that had lightened. But when they unveiled her mother's memorial stone, gathered at the graveside 1 year after the death, according to custom, while we were standing around about to begin the prayers, her car appeared. It was a black car. The ground was deep in snow. My mother got out and walked toward us across the field of gravestones capped with snow, her coat black as the car, and they waited to start the prayers until she arrived. I think she enjoyed the drama. I can't remember if she prayed or not, but that may be the way I'll remember her best. Dark figure, awaited, attended, aware, apart. The present upon time passed striketh. With Phoebus's wandering course the earth is graced. The air still moves, and by its moving cleareth. The fire up ascends, and planets feedeth. The water passeth on, and all lets weareth. The earth stands still, yet change of changes breedeth. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for your
Thank you all so much for coming, and of course, next year in Jerusalem, a peaceful Jerusalem.